Parkinson's disease is now the fastest growing neurological disease in the world. Over 1 million Americans are living with Parkinson's right now, and almost 100,000 more will be diagnosed just this year alone. Most of them will never see a doctor who could actually help change their outcome. My guest today spent over 20 years as one of the personal doctors to the legendary boxer Muhammad Ali after his Parkinson's diagnosis. Since then, he spent the rest of his career making sure that every family gets the same quality of Parkinson's care that the rich and famous get. Dr. Michael Okun is a neurologist, a New York Times bestselling author, and the medical director of the Parkinson's Foundation. He and one of our prior guests, Dr. Ray Dorsey, together wrote the best-selling book, The Parkinson's Plan. If you know someone who has Parkinson's, this episode is for you. I'm Neil K. Shah, a Johns Hopkins and NIH-funded caregiving researcher, CEO of Caregiver, and a caregiver myself. Dr. Okun, so glad you're here. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, Neil.
Awesome. So I don't even know where to begin. I have so many questions and you have so many insights. So I guess maybe first of all, just to kick it off, you have coined this term. And many people may not have heard it, but although people in the Parkinson's community, I think, have the Parkinson's pandemic. Over 1 million Americans have it. It's growing very fast. What do you think is going on? You were ahead of the curve on this one. What's going on, and why aren't more and more people talking about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, preface by saying Neil accidentally coined the term. We were writing a book with the Parkinson Foundation back in 2012, 2013, called 10 Secrets to a Happier Life, Parkinson's Treatment. And it sort of was a real lesson in my career because, I had written all these papers. You're a researcher too. We put out, hundreds and hundreds of papers. Nobody reads these papers, but the factor of 1,000 of how many people read the 10 Secrets book taught me a lesson. And of course, all the books we publish, we put all the proceeds back to charities and to making sure people can get information. So it was a real eye opener. In the prologue, in the intro to that book, I sort of maybe carelessly as a researcher said the words Parkinson pandemic, referring to this idea that we had a drip, drip, drip of all these papers that were coming out, that it looked like, these levels of Parkinson are going up. And when I see one paper, I always tell the students, one paper is one paper, two papers is two papers, three starts to get interesting, 5, 10, 15, 20 really gets interesting. And then sometimes it gets a little bit lost. And so I maybe carelessly made the comment, the Parkinson pandemic, maybe a little bit too flippant with it. It turns out that's the kind of thing you don't want it to turn out to be true. But it turned out that that we were growing, very fast and much faster than people realized. Young people, older people, and of course the term pandemic. By the way, when you think of Greek and Latin, you think pan means all, demos means people, and so I think it's appropriate we use that term for infectious diseases. But it also could be, technically applied to these other disorders and things when we have explosive growth. And however you term it, I just think we have to pay attention. This is a huge burden. It's a huge caregiving burden. It's a huge burden on society, and it's needless suffering, particularly if one day we can get, to prevention and to better treatments.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think that in some, and I'm kind of going to weave through the conversation because I think you have some really interesting insights about the care model, and how we should do Parkinson's care better. But I think, of course, many people might just be interested that you were the personal doctor to the legendary boxer Muhammad Ali, for over 20 years after his Parkinson's diagnosis, and many people might have seen him holding the Olympic torch back in the day, but one of his arms shaking. Like what did you see, when you watched those kind of moments, and what did, helping care for him teach you about living with Parkinson's, and how that could apply to those out there that are living with it today?
Yeah, well, I want to, make sure that people understand that there were lots of doctors and lots of healthcare professionals that cared for Muhammad Ali. I was just one of many. The late Malin DeLong, who was my mentor at Emory University, was really the, kind of the guy that was the most consistent care for him. And then Malin and I and Helen Mayberg, who's a very well-known researcher and neurologist in Mount Sinai. We wrote a paper, we actually didn't talk about it for many years. And the reason we don't talk about it is you want to have permission from people, that they say, okay, it's okay to talk about our case. And so when they went public, we wrote a paper in a journal called JAMA Neurology, and help people to understand. And one of the things that was really interesting is, and when it comes to Muhammad Ali, people just assume because he got hit in the head a lot that this is what caused his Parkinson. But look more carefully, open that book up. We've seen lots of people with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This is the big words that describe when you get hit your head, either in an explosion, or on a playing field, like an NFL playing field, or in a boxing ring, that you get these changes. And certainly he did get hit in the head some as a boxer, but he had dopamine responsive, okay, which is different than what we see in NFL players and soccer players and people coming back from wars with blast injuries. He had dopamine responsive, young onset, more on one side of the body than another, and a high amplitude tremor. You give him the medications, it goes away. And so I think people didn't realize that, young people can get Parkinson too. And he's a great example of that, and, lived for 30 plus years. But also the idea that it doesn't matter like how very important you are, if you're a very important person or not. There are so many people that are out there, and the lessons for care and the lessons for caring for folks are really important. And all of the families, including those families, struggle with the same things that we do. We're all human by nature. And so I think some of the humbling things that we learn, when we look at these cases, is how they can translate to help us. But also when folks that have Parkinson speak up and speak out, Muhammad Ali, Michael J. Fox, you see Carly Simon came out, recently, Ozzy Osbourne, people say, oh, well, it's interesting, right? But when people have the courage to come out, and the Osbourne family is another great example of the courage to come out and talk about the caregiving aspects, talk about the aspects of having the disease, it's really important, it's really powerful, and it's an opportunity for us to educate the public on how we can help folks to have a healthier and happier life, even with a diagnosis of Parkinson's.
Totally. And also thanks for mentioning Carly Simon, because that was actually my next question, and actually a combination question of this, that, Carly Simon has gone public with having Parkinson's, I think, in the last couple of weeks. And, she said some interesting things that, were some of the points that you've made, where she's describing, beyond just kind of the motor symptoms, the exhaustion, the apathy, that it's not sadness or laziness, but it just feels like the part of the brain that wants to participate in life, is temporarily misplaced. I think, and that one of my questions prior to her diagnosis for you was around that most people think of Parkinson's as a tremor disease, but you actually think there are many other symptoms that are non-motor symptoms that are both worth paying attention to, and that will actually determine quality of life for people with Parkinson's, that many people are ignoring or not treating. So I guess, yeah, can you both talk about Carly's example and just the overall, thought of like,
Yeah.
what are these other things that,
I
people.
was so pleased to see Carly Simon come public. And not only that, what she had to say. Because the data and all of the papers, remember, I already told you, everybody reads the books that we write, but they don't read any of the papers. And so sometimes the information doesn't translate. All of these papers that our group and many other groups around the world have written about symptoms like depression, anxiety, apathy, sexual dysfunction, autonomic dysfunction, all of these things that we see, they are actually more disabling than the visible tremors and the visible movement disorders. And so you use the term non-motor symptoms. It's an old-fashioned term. I don't love it. It's kind of like saying anything that's not moving, but it turns out these, let's call them sometimes invisible, and many of them are
Mm.
invisible symptoms, are so important. Now, fast forward to Carly Simon. Carly Simon then, brings up something that I think she might be the first, sort of celebrity that we've seen in the news bring apathy to the, front and center. And I think that was awesome. And, I'm sorry that she's having apathy, but apathy is actually more common than depression and more common than the other symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Very common, super common. And we all talk about, oh, you're depressed, you're anxious, right? or you're demoralized. Demoralization is the other thing that happens to 1 in 5 people with Parkinson. Completely treatable, completely predictable. You're gonna have Parkinson. Of course, you're gonna get demoralized. We should lean in and say, yes, of course. Let us help you with the demoralization. People don't talk about apathy. Apathy is when you just start to either lose interest in what we say activities that you would normally do. So that, people call that, like the things that are everyday activities, or activities that are maybe not, as the normal things that you do, but maybe going out to a concert or going out to, to do things or out to dinner. So some of those things, as it worsens, you begin to withdraw. And what happens is the front part of your brain, called the frontal lobe, is really important to how you initiate in life and how you inhibit. And so when this works well, you're able to interact with the world as a human because of the frontal lobe. Parkinson picks on that frontal lobe, and one of the most common things that we see is apathy that Carly Simon brings up, and people aren't talking about it. So kudos to Carly Simon, super important. And for those of you wondering about treatments for apathy, we need more treatments. So a number of us are looking at the circuitry, the brain circuitry in laboratories of what underpins what causes that apathy. There are some things like cognitive behavioral therapies. There's a program called the PALS, PALS, that was developed here by Dr. Bowers and Dr. Butterworth. Dr. Butterworth now at the University of South Florida, Dr. Bowers at the University of Florida with us, as a treatment program for apathy. People have suggested some medications, although it's been tricky to treat. I think identification, removing the uncertainty for people and saying, yes, it's okay that you have this. Let's see what we can do about it, is going to be important. But there's also, until we lean in, Neil, we're not going to develop treatments because people aren't going to realize this is so disabling. So thank you to Carly Simon for bringing it forward.
Yeah, no, and thank you for the detailed explanation too. Because I think that's helpful for a lot of people who might even be listening to, Carly Simon's statements that, you know, it might be easy to get confused apathy with general depression, and I think that the way you've kind of laid it out highlights the difference, which means that there's a different approach in how to treat and how to help people. So, no, I think that's really helpful. I think,
I also should mention, I'm just gonna actually add and pile on there just
yeah,
for a
yeah,
second, pile
please,
on top of that comment.
yeah,
That Dr. Bowers here, it's we call her the apathy queen. It's probably not a great description, but because she's published so many papers. Lindsay Kirschdero, who was at Hopkins, was one of our graduate students who went on to a career at Hopkins. She published the first paper that showed the difference in how you can have apathy without depression and without cognitive dysfunction. That's thinking dysfunction. So you can have apathy without depression and without cognitive dysfunction, which is really important. It could just be isolated, or it could keep company with one of these other two things. And so it is important to focus on all three when you're identifying and treating.
yeah. Yeah, that's great, and that shifts me to kind of thinking about the care team. It seems like you've spent a lot of time thinking about, the care team, model, and what should the right care team look like. I think in some of the other things I read about you, you have this idea of like the patient as like the sun, maybe the center. You know, to think about the family caregivers as like a vital link with the clinical team. I think, yeah. Can you elaborate on that? If like in an ideal world, how do you think someone with Parkinson's should be cared for, and what should the care team be structured
Yeah,
at?
well, let me just start out by saying we're doing it wrong. Okay. Not just in the United States, but all over the world. We're doing it wrong. We have all the chess pieces, meaning we have all the people we need to do it right. We just don't do it right. If we look outside ourselves to things like cancer, HIV, diabetes, they're doing it better. Maybe not perfect, but they're doing it better. We have to accept that diseases like Parkinson's disease are chronic diseases, and we need a different model of care. Then those people that know me know I'm this broken record for over 20 years. That, when Dr. Kelly Foote and we founded this institute here at the University of Florida 20 years ago called the Fixel, now called the Fixel, and we, have this broken record. People say, man, Okun, he's a broken record. He just keeps saying the patient's the sun. Everybody should revolve around the patient. That also means in research and teaching and care as well. And so it's all missions, but it is most important that when we think about We need to get the right care for folks with Parkinson, and they don't need it, like even the way we do it now. We get to a multidisciplinary where we get them all these services at Fixel on the same day or over 2 days. That's awesome. But when you have a chronic disease, when you need a specific service, you need it now. Like you need it. The urgency is now, particularly for mental health, for falling, for mobility, for prevention of fractures. These things are really important. So there's a preventative aspect to the care, and then there's there's an urgent aspect, and then there's a maintenance aspect. And so we've kind of rethought this, and in a way, maybe we took a match or a lighter and we lit the patient as the sun, like model, and said this needs to be a little bit bigger. And so in our newest book, The Parkinson Plan, Ray Dorsey and I talk about a Parkinson's universe. And so the person with the disease is still the sun. The closest planet to the sun is Mercury. Mercury is the caregiver or care partner. It gets hot being close to the sun, but they're also the interface against the other planets. What are the other planets? There are all these other specialties that need to rotate in when you need them. So neuropsychologists for thinking, psychiatrists for mental health, right? Big problem in the country, not just for Parkinson, but all over the world, not just in the United States. You physical, occupational, speech, swallow therapists, nutritionists, social workers, right? All of these people need to be in rotation out there and revolving around, so when they're needed, they can come in. Then there's a planet that's out there called Pluto. It's like the almost planet, and it's cold, and it's out there, and it's still always in the orbit. We refer to that as the planet that represents stigma. So when you have Parkinson's, there's the uncertainty of diagnosis. Once you get past that uncertainty, then you move on, and you have to function in society. Society doesn't accept people with chronic diseases like Parkinson's as they should. And so stigma is always there. There's some studies that show up to half or more of people hide their diagnosis of Parkinson. It's hard enough to have Parkinson. And when you talk to people, and we've done on book tours all over the world, and I remember being in Houston, Texas, and a woman standing up and saying, I hate telling people I have Parkinson because, then they start talking to me differently, and they start, thinking I can't do stuff, and they don't understand. And so, this is a real problem. So stigma is always there. And then, we think about the other things. What can we use to improve our universe, right? So there are satellites that orbit. This could be telemedicine. We could bring care to the home, wearable devices for continuous monitoring, making sure people are sleeping and doing all those things. And of course, Neil, the asteroid field. And this might be the favorite, Ray Dorsey's favorite line of mine that I wrote in the book was using a Star Wars analogy where you've got, Han Solo and Chewbacca, and they're flying this gigantic, ship, the Millennium Falcon. It's kind of clunky, and they're going through an asteroid field, and they're asking the question, what are the odds we're going to make it through here and survive, right? I look at that as a person with Parkinson. What are the odds you're going to survive the American healthcare system? They're pretty low. They're like one in, whatever, just like, Han Solo and Chewbacca were looking out at this field. And so we have to remove barriers, get people access. People don't have access to care, particularly, in different regions and different zip codes. We've got to improve the care. We've got to improve the access. We've got to make sure that folks are getting the care when they need it, and that it's not just the best specialty centers like Fixel at UF. Not to say we're the best, but like we have a model that's pretty good, and to make sure that those types of services happen for everyone. And when you have a crisis, a fall, a mental health crisis or whatever, you need care when you need care. So we're advocating for thinking about how we can change those models in a different way. I'm sitting as a public member of the Parkinson Advisory Council, the National Council for Parkinson. And so I'm chairing that subcommittee on care, and we're taking questions. We're listening to people right now, and you can actually write in publicly to that committee and give your suggestions. But we want to, ultimately give suggestions up to the directors of HHS and to Congress about changes that we can make with our chess pieces. So maybe we can do something practical to improve our situation for people with Parkinson's. And so we don't have all the answers, Neil, but we're at least honest enough to say we're doing it wrong.
That's awesome. I love the analogy too. Like, I think a lot of caregivers out there can relate. I don't think I've ever heard that, and it's awesome. I might use that analogy of the caregiver as Mercury, closest to the sun, but you're gonna get hot. I think that's interesting. I think the asteroid belt, I mean, I think that is to anyone that's navigating the healthcare system and any kind of like major illness, I think it's, really resonates. So, no, I mean, I think the analogy is awesome. Also, by the way, do you mind sharing? I thought that was very interesting that you said the National Parkinson's Advisory Committee is taking public input. How can people reach out? Like, if there are people listening right now that are living with Parkinson or that are caring for someone or that have cared for someone, where can they reach out to make their suggestion and their voices heard so that the government
Yeah.
might, listen to their
Great
challenges?
question. So there's a national advisory council, and Gus Bilirakis and Jennifer Wexton and several other Paul Tonko, several other people came together in a bipartisan fashion a couple of years ago to pass a bill, the Ending Parkinson Disease bill. It was named after Gus Bilirakis, whose family has Parkinson. He's from a Greek family of sponge divers, and in Tarpon Springs, Florida, where there's a lot of Greek families there. He and his father have represented that district. His father's 96 for over 40 years, and the people of that district. And Jennifer Wexton ended up with a diagnosis of progressive supranuclear palsy. So it also covers these more what they call atypical or different forms of Parkinson, disease as well. They came together with Paul Tonko and several other people. It passed the House of Representatives 407 to 9. So those who think we can't be bipartisan, healthcare, health research, diseases, suffering, caregiving, these are all bipartisan issues. 407 to 9. In the Senate, you know what it passed at? It passed at unanimous. Unanimous. And some people go into Congress and there's little lights that you vote with, red and green and everything, and they never hit the green light. Unanimous, okay, in the Senate, signed by the President of the United States into law, and it formed this council. If you Google the council, or you Google or use any of the search engines or any of the new, AI tools, if you Google, you'll see, and you ask any of, Google, Gemini, whatever, and you ask them Parkinson Advisory Council, how do I make things? It'll give you addresses and emails and things that you can send in that information. If you can't get it, I work for the state, so I work for the state of Florida. I'm publicly available too. You can send it to me and I will send it in on your behalf. But we read everything that comes in from people. And there are two subcommittees, myself and John Duda, who is the head of the VA Parkinson Project Network. We're co-chairing one with Jessica Shearer from the Cure PSP network. We have one group that's working on care, and then there's a separate parallel group that's also under Debbie Brooks working, and Alice Chen Plotkin and a couple of great researchers on that side that are working on the research side, and we're working together. So we're taking suggestions on both sides. But I believe that, and I'm very happy and pleased to tell people on this podcast that we're just as interested in the generation of people and the expanding generation of people who have Parkinson now that we need to care for now, that we're really concerned, interested, and we definitely want your.
That's awesome. I think that's really cool to hear that, the government and people in the, kind of clinical community are openly soliciting feedback from individuals. So I think that many people will reach out after hearing this, and we'll search for the links and we'll put some of the links in the notes on when we post this. But that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, and also thanks for the work in doing that. Um, I think in thinking through some of the other, treatments that you talked about, you have been, on the leading edge of deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of like many people might think it's a last resort, that's something you might do when nothing else is working. And I believe you've said that that might be a backwards way to think about it. I guess, yeah, could you share more of like, how do you think about deep brain stimulation?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. I would say, first of all, I would start the story, for me, starts a quarter century ago. And then as I got my first job, so I've actually stayed here at University of Florida, and at Fixel for my whole career. So I'm kind of like Cal Ripken, you're close to
Nice.
the,
Nice.
like,
Yeah.
like, you know, doing my time here across, but enjoying it. But as I got my first job and coming out, 25 years ago, the idea of sticking things in people's brains, was considered a little bit of maybe snake oil, and like there wasn't going to be much to this. It wasn't going to last. So a lot of people that I really respect, thought, like this is, don't be surprised when this is gone. Don't embarrass us. Don't hurt anybody when you're doing this. What happened, Neil, though, was something really amazing. And I don't think there's any neuroscientist that could have predicted the power of this type of treatment, pushing in just a little bit of electricity into the brain. And that's kind of what it is. It's like I think of a really skinny straw that we can stick into any, structure in the brain. And we try to miss blood vessels, right? So we don't cause any bleeding or anything like that. But if we can slip it past the blood vessels and not cause any damage or any strokes, and we've gotten pretty good at that, we can then get it into structures and the connections between structures. And what has happened is we've realized that these are circuits, just like the circuits in your house. When the circuit box goes off and everything, your brain is running on all of these circuits. And then when we talk about a disease like Parkinson's disease, the basal ganglia, don't want to throw out big words on your podcast, but that's the name of the group of circuits. You don't need to remember that. But it turns out that we can modulate these. And when we went in early days, and I was taught how to do this by Malin DeLong, who was one of the pioneers. He won the Lasker Award. He was actually at Hopkins before he was at where you are, before he was at Emory. And for recording out of these structures and really giving us the basis, building the foundation of that house and understanding these structures, they are talking to each other all the time in the brain, and that's normal. And then in Parkinson's, the conversation becomes abnormal. And a lot of times the brain looks very much the same, but the conversation becomes abnormal. And he appreciated that and then realized if you push electricity into the brain, you can change these conversations and improve symptoms. It's been a mind-blowing, journey, to be on, not just for Parkinson's. My lab does Tourette and dystonia and tics, and we work with Icicle Gundes and biomedical engineering, Kelly Foote, many other really gifted researchers to think about how we can develop new devices. And where this is going is we had this revolution of giving dopamine as a replacement for Parkinson. Huge, like still the single best treatment for Parkinson disease, which tells us we need to develop more treatments, right, when it's over 50 years old. But then the next generation was we could make holes in the brain. So that's what Malin DeLong taught us. We could see where the abnormal conversations and we could make a hole, and by making a hole or a lesion in the brain, we could improve the symptoms, or we could put electricity in. And now we're getting really good at developing the devices, the techniques, and how we do it. And we're getting really good at decoding the language. So the language comes out, and then we can use AI, AI, automated intelligence. Smart computers is basically, if anybody wants to know what AI is, it's smart, fast computers, right? We use smart, fast computers to make decisions in real time as those conversations are going on. Now we're changing those conversations. And so we now are, moving this out in multiple areas. Our lab works on it in Tourette, for example, where everything looks normal. And then suddenly there's a burst of activity in the brain that's abnormal. We can use these devices to pick those up and respond in real time. And so a lot of the technologies, how we're giving stimulation to the brain, how we're thinking about this, have continued to evolve and get better and better as we've gotten better and better. There's still a huge issue for caregiving because as we developed this more, we did something that was unintentional. We've now made it really complicated, Neil. And, like too many settings, too many things. And so we're going to need computers and robots and everything to eventually help us to make this simpler, make it safer, scale it and get it to more people. Not everybody is a candidate for these types of surgery. So if you're listening, you have Parkinson at any one time, 10 or 20% of you may be a candidate at some point during your Parkinson and higher, like if you just look at the lifetime of Parkinson, and it's really good for things like tremor. These are abnormal, kind of oscillations or tremors. Then you get these dance-like movements from taking medication called dyskinesia. And sometimes the medicines are wearing off and going off and on. Those are the things that, the DBS is really tremendous, or making a lesion, either an old-fashioned lesion by burning a hole in the brain or using something like focused ultrasound. These are all great, techniques potentially. And thinking about who's you know, the right procedure for the right patient. Not everybody needs two sides. And then just one last thing for folks that are listening, if you have a lot of thinking problems or a lot of walking and falling problems, this may not be, the optimal therapy for you. And so we use a multidisciplinary team. And I always say we get our team together, we spend a day or two, 8 or 9 people see you, and then we do something that sounds bad, but it's good. We talk behind your back, and that's called multidisciplinary care. That's what you want. You want a whole bunch of people seeing you, talking behind your back, creating, kind of what's the risk benefit, and then coming back to you, because in the end, the choice should be yours. Here's the risks, here's the benefits. Should we do one side, two sides? Which target should we do? Should we do a lesion? Should we put a device in? Is it going to help the symptoms? Is it going to help that walking symptom and freezing? It may not. So the juice may not be worth the squeeze. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. It's still a very powerful treatment, and folks should know it's not a cure. It's a symptomatic treatment, but boy, it can make a big difference for the right folks that are selected.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing all the detail, not just in how it works, but also the thinking behind it and how your team, evaluates and plans. So I think that's super helpful. I think that in some of the thinking around what's going on, I think big picture with Parkinson's, I think of course we had Ray Dorsey on the show, a couple weeks ago, and he basically spent the entire episode making the case that it's a largely man-made disease that's driven by pesticide exposure and other chemicals. And I think that, obviously you've been working with him for a long time and you've co-written several books together, and especially your recent book, The Parkinson's Plan. Where do you guys agree on some of those topics? And more importantly, where do you guys see things differently?
Yeah, good question. We had a wonderful interview on 1A with Todd Whitehurst. And before we went on, Todd told us, hey, by the way, I was a neuroscientist in my last career. I studied neuroscience. We're like, oh no, this, this is going to be a tough interview, right? Because he knows a lot about the brain. But we had a really fun time. And Todd wanted us to spar a little bit. And what has been so much fun in writing the Parkinson Plan, we wrote a book called Ending Parkinson's Disease, close to the Ending Parkinson Act many years ago in 2020. What's been so much fun writing with Ray is that we actually are all disagreeing all the time. Like we're on the phone all the time. Like he was texting me last night. We are pushing back and forth on things. And we're saying, okay, here's the evidence, here's where it is. How much evidence do we have? How replicable is the evidence? And how far out there can you go, right? And so in terms of like the ideas, Ray will think, like, okay, here's this idea, here's this big idea. And then I'll say, okay, well, let me look at the evidence. Let me drill down from a scientific thing and look at the evidence. Where are we with this? What's reasonable? And what's not reasonable. And then what do scientists think? And so you go out there and you say to a group of scientists, you say, Parkinson might be caused by pesticides. And people are like, like come on, you guys are nuts, right? And so that's where I start with Ray. Like we start the conversation there where I go, Ray, you're nuts, right? And then, we drill in, I look at the evidence, we go back and forth on all of these concepts, and we sort of, come to a medium where we say, okay, well, maybe this isn't as crazy as we thought. Maybe we've actually known, even on standardized testing, we've been asked, like what causes Parkinson? Well water, oh my gosh, like we've known well water for decades and decades and decades, right? Right. Associated with Parkinson. We didn't do anything with the information, right? We've known a lot of these pesticides, particularly TCE and dry cleaning, everything. We're not doing anything with the information. You start to look at the odds ratios. It's like if you go to Las Vegas and you cast a bet, like what the odds ratio is 1, that means it's a push, it's chance, right? If it's above 1, it's higher than that. And some of these are way above 1, and so you think, and then you think, Neil, what about the Industrial Revolution? How many cases of Parkinson did we have versus the population? What changed when our air, water, and food, and it wasn't like we did these things like pesticides to make people sick. We actually did them for a good reason, to create food for more people on the earth, right? To keep the pests off the food. Side means killer, right? Pest, aside, right? Aside in Latin. So it wasn't like we did it for a bad reason. It wasn't like the Industrial Revolution, was created to try to pollute the air and then pollute the water sources in our cities. We inadvertently did these things. And the question is what do these things do to disease, not just cancer, but also to Parkinson? When we see one study, Neil, then I say to Ray, hey man, you only got one study. Come on, you know? And you know, when I see three, when I see five, when I see eight, when I see 10, right? And so we agree that Parkinson is, 15% of it or so, plus or minus a few points, are single gene abnormalities. We agree that much more of it has to be explained, beyond genetics, in this particular disease. So there are a lot of environmental influences. And then where we're still struggling is the exposome. How do we begin to quantitate this in the post-industrial revolution age? And then convincing our colleagues to say, okay, yeah, I get it. Like you've been to medical school, you've gotten PhDs, you're smarter than us. Got it. But at some point, is there enough evidence that you take the courageous step of getting rid of some of these things or using alternatives and then seeing what happens to the rates of diseases like Parkinson's? And Europe has already started to do this. You can see the data is coming out in Germany. The data is coming out in the Netherlands. The data is coming out in the UK that their levels are starting to level, whereas our levels and China's levels are going up. Why is that? You have to ask that question, and then you go back and you look. They've been more proactive on these, banning of pesticides, chemicals, and things, making sure that supermarkets aren't next to people that are using TCE and dry cleaners. And so I think that we have to have big ideas, okay, to make changes. But I think we also have to have that banter. So what Todd Whitehurst likes is trying to get Ray and I going at it, at each other on every specific thing. And then the question comes up is, after you're done with all the banter, all the studies, all the replications, where are you today? You wake up tomorrow, there's 3 more studies. After you're done with that, are you ready to be courageous enough to make a change to try to get to primary prevention in Parkinson? And I think the argument that Ray Dorsey makes is a very strong argument that we're ready as a society to go ahead and remove as many of these things as possible and measure it, and then be humble to see what that does.
Thanks for the explanation. Actually, I want to. I thought you said something fascinating that I was not aware of. So maybe you could elaborate on that. That you mentioned that in Europe, in some of these countries, they have already started implementing these steps, and they're starting to see a difference in the trajectory of Parkinson's growth compared to U.S. or China that hasn't. I guess, yeah. Could you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of like, are there anything high level of like what has been the change that I believe I'm trying to remember the countries you mentioned, like Germany or Netherlands. What have they done, and then how has it affected, in your mind, kind of the change in trajectory? Because that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
The Europeans have been way out in front and on these issues. And sometimes they sort of, the beginning of the conversation, with Ray or with me is, you're wrong because look at us, and we're like, no, we're probably right because you did something, like there was an intervention here that happened. So if you go to any AI tool of your choice and you look up pesticides, look up trichloroethylene, look up perchloroethylene, and you look at when Paraquat was banned in various countries, Paraquat is one, but others as well. If you look at those and you look at the years, you'll see it goes back decades in some of these countries. If you look at some of the surveillance data across by Carly Tanner and others in the field, you'll see that the numbers are leveling in a number of these countries. And if you look at the most recent studies, they're leveling in some places, but not in others. This is fundamental, Neil, to this conversation. And the fundamental thing is this: as scientists, we're sort of used to, okay, we do an experiment. You're at Hopkins, Neil, you do an experiment. You want to see somebody in Scotland do the same experiment. You want to see somebody that, is in China or in Australia, or in Mumbai do the same experiment, right? So you can say it's replicable. When we think about the environment, we think about this issue that guess what? If you're in Korea, you're exposed to a lot of things in the city. You tend to stay with your family. You tend to live in the same place at the same time throughout that time. So controlling for air pollution, let's say on a study, might be easier than the United States, where we're in cars and we're all over the damn place and we never stay in the same place. We're like ADHD, like on, just as a society. I'm not saying we all have ADHD, but we bounce around to all these different places. Okay. So, so then it means depending on what zip code you're in, depending on which golf course you live closest to, depending on what they use, when there are all these factors that lay on. And so when I explain it to students, I say when it comes to environmental research, it's more difficult than just replicating an experiment in my laboratory on, let's say, deep brain stimulation or something like that. I look at it as transparencies. And so we're doing a lot of studies now at the University of Florida, a lot with Brittany Krasnowski and Ray Dorsey. And so we're starting to study the environment. And for people who remember what a transparency is, remember transparencies where you put it on top and you put one on top of the other, and then you shine the light on it and you
Yep.
can teach with it on top. So environmental research is like transparencies. You want to have information on a zip code, and you want to have the soil. You want to add the water transparency. You want to add the pesticide transparency. You want to keep adding the information up over the population that's going to be different, but don't assume like a regular experiment that if you're in Scotland, the Netherlands, Mumbai, that they're going to have the same data. They may have different data, and you have to interpret it in the context of what the environment looks like there. I think that's where we're struggling. However, we're in an era of big data now. Everybody loves to say AI. I say AI, and the market goes up. Like everybody loves to say AI, but perhaps this is where AI can help us.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing and elaborating on that. I think, then a couple other questions, I had around, you've said that there are myths about Parkinson's that are actively, harmful for patients right now. What's maybe if you had to pick number one myth that you wish you could, wipe out completely?
Yeah, so boy, I'd wipe out a bunch of them for a while, but if I could wipe out one, it would be just that people understand that Parkinson isn't one disease. And just because you have Parkinson doesn't mean you have Alzheimer's, and doesn't mean you have ALS, which is, Lou Gehrig's disease. It doesn't mean you have a brain tumor. And that many of the subtypes of Parkinson that we see folks that are treated well for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on which subtype you have. And so it's a myth to think that you can't live a good life with Parkinson. And that was part of the 10 Secrets to a Happier Life book. And in fact, in 2027, Ray Dorsey, myself, and our colleague and friend, I call them my little brothers because they're both 6 foot, like 6'7", Boston Bloom and Ray Dorsey and I are writing a book called The Parkinson 100, which is a sequel to that 10 Secrets book, giving people kind of these things to think about. But the myth is that you have Parkinson and it's over. And Larry Gifford, who runs the PD Avengers group, along with Sonia Mathor and Tim Hake, Senior, um, the three of them, have been really, pushing the idea that Parkinson is not a death sentence; it's a life sentence. But if you change your life, you can live well. The other, myths, just to throw them out real quick. One is that Parkinson isn't just a disease of dopamine. Okay, there's a lot of chemicals, and so if you focus only on dopamine, you're going to miss even the thing you started the podcast on today, non-motor symptoms. And so norepinephrine, serotonin, other things. Don't think that those are not important. Those are super important. And then the myth that Sanjay Gupta and I riffed on a little bit because he kind of brought it to my attention when he said on his podcast, he said, Michael, I never thought of Parkinson as a full body disease, and I'm a neurosurgeon, right? And it turns out Parkinson's is in the skin, Parkinson is in the gut, it's in multiple organs, and it's not just the brain. And so it's not just a brain disease. You have to approach it as a whole body disease. We have to think about vitamins, we have to think about bone health, we have to think about skin health, twice the risk of melanoma, twice the risk of osteoporosis. Since you talk about caregiving, we got to, tell people these things, got to be on a multivitamin because dopamine is going to reduce your B6 and B12 and can increase something called homocysteine that can clog your arteries. And so, you know, blowing these myths up is really important for care and caregiving.
Thank you for sharing. I think I have a feeling people are going to replay that last few minutes of what you said, because it was like really insightful, and I certainly am going to like go back and listen to that. So I think that that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing. And then I think speaking of caregiving, I think that a lot of our audience, we primarily have a lot of caregivers who are following the work and might be watching the show, and it might be either an adult children caring for a parent with Parkinson or somebody caring for a spouse, and oftentimes caregivers feel like they're playing catch up. So, if you're in the caregiver shoes, I guess if you could narrow it down, what's the one most important question they should be asking at their loved one's, next appointment that they probably aren't asking? Or if there's more than one, feel free to share.
Yeah, I'm really glad you you're asking me about what to ask, like that's the and we as we expanded from 10 secrets, over 10 years ago, and we're talking about 100 secrets, we actually go into some, granular detail on how important it is to be ready for the visit. And one of the things that we're recommending that people do is that they actually start having conversations before they go to the healthcare providers. And there's lots of healthcare providers. It can be your physical therapist. It doesn't just have to be your doctor or your advanced practice provider. It could be your speech therapist. But having a conversation before you go in about what's going on, and what's important is critical. The second thing is that, in that conversation, we're recommending that people um, separate before they get to the office of the healthcare workers. What are the 3 or 4 things that are most important to them, the person with Parkinson? What are the 3 or 4 things that are most important to the caregiver or care partner? And we know we've done the data on it with Parkinson Foundation, and many people have done. University of Oregon has done really amazing work on caregiver strain. It's more than half of caregivers and care partners with Parkinson have significant care partner and caregiver strain. And so we need to be spending as much time with them as we spend, with the person with disease. And so a lot of times when I'm there with a fellow or a student, they say, "Oh my gosh, like you're addressing and looking the other person in the eyes." And I'm like, "Guess what? The data says if we don't treat the care partner, the care person, you're going to end up in the emergency room. You're going to end up with a worse outcome." And in fact, the data also suggests Parkinson's is more common in men than in women. True, nobody will question that. Okay. But if you are a woman with Parkinson, the caregiving that you get and the social support that you get is less than you're a man with Parkinson, and your risks of morbidity, mortality, and everything are higher a lot of times because of the emergency room and making sure somebody's paying attention. So we have to challenge the men who are caregivers and care partners to step up. And when I challenge them, Neil, they all say the same thing to me. "Oh, I'm great. I step up." I'm like, "Look, I'm sure you are great, man, but the data says your group is not, so we need to get you to step up and realize that. Be ready for the appointments and make sure that you come and you come with the list of things that are important for each side of the equation, and that knowing that more than half the time the care partner or caregiver is having caregiver strain, you've got to address that. If you don't address that, it's going to make the situation worse. So you're actually worsening the situation for the person with Parkinson if you're the care provider. And so those are kinds of the things that we stress with folks.
That's awesome. Thanks for the detailed answer, and also for acknowledging the caregiver strain. I think that's like kind of number one thing that we try to advocate for is just the caregiver strain is profound in many of these. Most of our work is around dementia caregiving, but also we're seeing it increasingly around Parkinson's. And I mean, the caregivers themselves are burned out. Many of them have their own underlying health conditions as well, which sometimes get ignored due to the caregiving responsibility. So yeah, thanks for
The
acknowledging that.
data The
Um,
data is incontrovertible. And, I've been working as a medical director, medical advisor now for Parkinson Foundation for over 20 years. We have a free 1-800 number 4 PD info helpline for people, free. You can talk to, and we have multidisciplinary specialists. You can talk to a real person, and the younger people don't know this, but there are actually numbers and letters on your telephone keypad. So 1-800, the number 4 PD info, you can talk to a person at Parkinson Foundation. And we know, and we've done the studies, and we have, database studies, and then also studies from many centers of excellence, that number is totally true. And we're just not paying attention to it. It's another example where we have the data and we're not acting on it.
yeah. Agreed. Agreed. Okay, last question before then we'll do some rapid fire. But the last long form question is, you've personally answered over 20,000 questions, I think, from patients and families around the world through the Parkinson's Foundation online forum. You know, what's the most common question that breaks your heart every time you see it?
Yeah, so it's probably more than 20,000 because we started out with like a DOS-based system and then and now we've actually graduated to a real person. We have grants now and we have people so you can call in. So we've retired that system. So like I'm getting arthritis from typing all those answers and everything. Um, the most common question and the most common thing that is disabling that we hear about is actually constipation, and it's way, way undervalued. And it's because people are thinking about all these other things, but it actually affects quality of life quite a bit. It's very treatable. Even on our website on Fixel, we have a constipation formula. Every center of excellence for Parkinson has their own formula for foods and things like that. Then for thinking about over the counter medications. But people also forget that there's been a randomized study showing drugs like lubiprostone, lubiprostone, also sold as Amitiza in some countries, is very safe and helps with constipation. And so there are a whole bunch of options. And we have GI doctors that can help us too. So we have a GI clinic. So when we can't figure it out, we have Dr. Manny Amaris here that helps us figure it out. So disabling, so heartbreaking. It's like when you fix it, for somebody, you fix their plumbing. Oh my gosh, like it's really important. And constipation is one of those symptoms that can happen even before the motor symptoms of Parkinson. So it is there with them for a long time. Breaks my heart to see people with it and not get treated. And it's one of those things we can jump on, and we hear about it all the time. And in fact, we used to do web traffic reports like early on when we were trying to figure out how to use websites, like all of these questions and answers were through the evolution of having figure out how these websites and web forums work, and they go from DOS to really advanced sites. And when you look at the web traffic, Neil, people ask a lot of questions, if not the most questions about constipation. They're looking for constipation and Parkinson. And so it's one of kind of the things that I say, let's sniff that one out. Let's do that. Maybe not sniff it out. Maybe that was a bad analogy, but let's take care of them.
That's awesome. And by the way, also just thanks for what a great service. The fact that you guys are fielding these questions and answering. I think both individually you're able to help all these people, but then you're able to really understand kind of the market of like what is going on with people and what problems they're having. So that's really awesome that the Parkinson's Foundation just kind of runs that, forum of like
Yeah,
ability
and
for people to ask these
it's
questions.
totally hero. It's a total hero service, but it's also been life changing for a lot of people. And then being able to talk to a human. I know that we're in the AI world, and AI. We talk about this in the Parkinson plan, even for questions and answers, is going to play a big role in the future. There's still nothing like picking up the phone and talking. We have nurses, we have physical therapists, we have occupational therapists, we have people from different specialties. Picking up the phone, talking it through with somebody, no replacement, particularly in a healthcare system where you're lucky to get parking and you're lucky to see the same person. I know when I get my dermatology appointment, I'm rushing over there because I don't want to be 2 minutes late. I don't want them to cancel it because I got my one shot per year to get in there. Imagine you have Parkinson, right? And so talking to a real person for as much time as you like, priceless.
Totally agree. Totally agree. All right. So now, rapid fire questions. The last thing before we let you go. So, try to give kind of the most punchy, quick 1 or 2 sentence answers on these. I have a few of them. Okay. Someone just got diagnosed with Parkinson's. First thing they should do.
Number one thing that you should do if you get diagnosed with Parkinson disease is try to see a specialist if you can. Somebody who is board certified, or at least if your country doesn't have certifications, has some expertise in Parkinson disease, and do not go down the rabbit hole of thinking it's Alzheimer's disease, ALS, or brain tumors. There is a healthy, happy existence. You can have a healthy, happy life with Parkinson.
Okay. If you had to pick only one for early Parkinson's, exercise or medication, what would it be and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. So everybody has to exercise, like, so I would choose exercise first, but it might be followed very closely behind with medications. Exercise is like a medication, does the same things to your brains as medication does. So you're actually asking me about the same thing, but you have to exercise every day with Parkinson disease. I recommend if you can still walk without any balance problems, walk with a partner or a dog. 7,000 steps a day is both good for general health. That's 4 20-minute walks. 4 20-minute walks. If you have trouble with your knees, you have trouble with, other things, then get a recumbent bike that can go under your desk, like one of the tiny ones, an exercise cycler, or a recumbent bike with a back on a chair like I'm sitting on. Exercise, like a
Okay.
drug.
That's awesome. And then the follow-up question to that is, does the type of exercise actually matter? Or is just any movement good movement?
We don't know the answer to that yet, but it seems like the evolving evidence is that the best kind of exercise is the kind that you're willing to do. Sweating is good because you can get your heart rate up. Boston Bloom, one of my colleagues from the Nijmegen from the Netherlands, always says, what you want to be is you don't want to be exercising so hard that you can't talk like we're talking now, but maybe it's just a little hard to complete that sentence. Then you know that your heart rate is getting up. Tai Chi, boxing, you choose the one that's best for you, but you choose the one that you're willing to do. And I always tell people the baseline should be 4 20-minute walks a day. If you're not exercising, doing anything else, start there. And or a recumbent bike, and then on days you're maybe doing other things, maybe you don't do the walking, count your steps. It's a good start.
Okay, now tremor or no tremor, does that tell us how severe someone's Parkinson's actually is?
According to pre-AI era and post-AI era, the presence or absence of a resting tremor does have some, predictive value of how mild your Parkinson disease is. So actually, it might sound counterintuitive, but the people with a resting tremor tend to have a more mild course of Parkinson disease than people without tremors. That doesn't apply completely across the board, but it is interesting. And we're plugging all these things into AI models. There's a group at Wheel Cornell up in New York that we've worked with. They talk about the inching subtype of Parkinson. So they put all the information in, not just tremors. And they say, okay, this person's probably going to be an incher. This person's going to be a rapid progressor. And they put them into different categories. In old fashioned terms, they used to talk about akinetic rigid. That means stiff and rigid versus tremor dominant, versus, posture and gait, posture and walking. So that's kind of the old fashioned. And now we're getting a little more granular as we get more data. In general, resting tremor, good thing, might sound counterintuitive.
Thanks. I think people find that interesting. Um, let's see. What's one thing that Muhammad Ali taught you that you couldn't have learned in a textbook?
So I would say that easy. That guy, he was gonna. It didn't matter what we did to him for procedure, for medication, for whatever. When it came time, when it was go time, he was gonna do it. He was gonna do it for his life. Whether it was lighting the torch or whatever it was, that guy was gonna do it. There was nothing that was gonna stop him. He had like this drive. And when I see people with Parkinson have this drive where I'm not going to let the Parkinson stop me from living, that is really important. He used to have a little quip, he made up all sorts of poems and sayings and things like that. He's famous for the shortest poem in the history of the world. You probably know this, Neil, is "We Me." If you look in Bartland's quotation book, but he used to say, "Ain't no joking, Dr. Okun," and he was making a play on the fact that I would tell him to do stuff and he'd be like, yeah, it doesn't matter if I do it or not, because I'm going to like be able to climb that mountain with or without you. Like he had that determination. So I think that is really important when you have a disease. You don't quit. When you get demoralized, 1 in 5 people get demoralized. You normally will get demoralized with the disease. That's when things go south really fast.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. I think, and then the last one, medical cannabis for Parkinson's symptoms. Is the evidence actually there?
Yeah, great question. So there are cannabinoid receptors. These are the cannabis receptors that take on the signals all over your brain and all over the parts of your brain that are important to Parkinson and to dopamine. So there is a whole bunch we don't know, and there's a whole bunch of sub receptors that might be better for this symptom versus another, anxiety versus motor versus other things. So there's a whole bunch of how much THC do you have, how much how much just regular CBD do you have? So there's a whole bunch of unanswered questions. In general, Neil, if you take a cross section of what we've seen on the studies so far and that are more randomized and more than just series are showing us that the motor symptoms of Parkinson are not like robustly responding to these, at least what's been tried on people for tremors and things like that. There may be some benefit. However, anxiety, anxiety, pain, and sleep. We're seeing quite a bit of anecdotal evidence. We're seeing people call in to the helpline at Parkinson Foundation for many years. And of course, when you have a THC in the product, it doubles your risk for car accidents. Just want to say that out loud so people know that in case you're driving. And some people, Parkinson, still drive, can be totally fine. Just be careful and get a checkup. And if you're not sure, you gotta have your family go to a rehab center and get a checkup. But the point with cannabis is this: pain, anxiety, and sleep, we're more sure some of these non-motor symptoms are improving. Sometimes when the non-motor symptoms improve, actually the motor scores also will follow and improve. So that may be some of the benefit that we're seeing and not capturing in the clinical trials. Other diseases, HIV, cancer, fatigue, weight loss syndromes, sometimes THC is good, and there's a continuous weight loss with Parkinson's disease. So there might be benefits there as well. And the anxiety, most of the anxiety medications are very sedating, with people. So for some people that have generalized anxiety disorder, even before they have Parkinson, they get Parkinson and it blows out of control. Thinking about these things, I think, is really important. Some people, when the medicine wears off, when the dopamine goes low, they get anxious. When the dopamine is high, they're not. And when they're fluctuating up and down, these medicines can help. And getting 6 to 8 hours a night of sleep is really important. So I don't think it's a yes or no binary question. I think there's receptors all over the brain. I remember in writing 10 Secrets, and then I wrote a book called 10 Breakthroughs many years ago, had a chapter on cannabis. And then a few years later, Sanjay Gupta comes out about cannabis. Maybe it's okay. So so I was kind of early on that boat of, let's keep an open mind, but let's see where the data's taking us. But I totally don't dismiss it and totally am open to it and in all of the folks that I see in my clinic.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that's a really nuanced answer. So, no, I mean, I think Michael, thanks so much for the conversation. I think this will be super informative to many of the people that are watching that are living with Parkinson's, and especially to their caregivers as well. I think that a lot of the work that you're doing is just like really inspirational. So I really appreciate you sharing the details. Please tell everybody, where can they find your book, The Parkinson's Plan, as well as where can they follow along in your work.
Yeah, so you can get the Parkinson plan. You can go to any online store like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whatever I think you can go to independent booksellers. Ray and I always say support your independent bookseller. So important that we keep books in our thing. So you can go to your independent booksellers. You can order it from any bookstore anywhere, all around the country. The publisher is Hachette. It's from Public Affairs. Is the publisher on that, but should be easy to get. You can Google it or go to parkinsonplan.org. You can read about, we have a newsletter. You can sign up for a newsletter as well and see the other books and things that we're working on. And we try to get as many books out to people, even people who can't afford them as well, through organizations and things around the world. And so we're passionate to try to help and create some positive influence on what we can do and believe there are things you can do today and tomorrow that are going to make Parkinson better. So pdplan.org, I would say, would be a good resource place to go for that. And then you can write to us if you have questions. We'll always answer your questions.
That's awesome. That's awesome. No, thanks so much for sharing. And there you have it, folks. If this episode hit home for you, please do one thing for us. Especially if you're caring for someone with Parkinson's or know someone who has it. Write down these questions that we talked about. Hopefully this can help you guide their next appointment. Also, if you haven't seen our prior episode with Dr. A. Dorsey, please go watch it now. That's been one of our more watched episodes in recent months. And we'll be sharing clips from this conversation across all the platforms over the next like 2 to 3 weeks. So if any of those make you think of someone you love, please send it their way. and follow along, if you're not subscribed yet. Dr. Michael Okun, thank you so much again. Truly, I thought this was a wonderful conversation. And, thank you to everyone that spent time with us. And we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for what you're doing, Neil, and thanks for having me.